Hello, my excellent internet friends. How about a quick update on, well, how's the hand doing rehab-wise? Okay, that is honestly something I thought I would never be able to do again. So, how did I celebrate this minor miracle? Well, by reacquainting myself with, shall we say, an old friend. Now that's a knife. Okay, I'm sorry, that has got to be like watching paint dry. Okay, before I get into the swords themselves, I wanted to put out an offer question about potential future content. And in that introduction, you saw me flipping around this. Now, I do have conventional style sai in my collection and have had since the late 70s. These, however, are a little bit more unusual. Sometimes they're referred to as yin-yang or a type of manji sai with this particular S-curve swept guard. Now, there's certain things about this design I actually like better, especially as I've crossed over to other kinds of weapon-based martial arts, including, yes, most recently, Hema. So if you'd like to see more content involving sai, jute, or maybe even tunfa, I'd be happy to try to oblige. I've been studying and training with these things for, well, again, since the late 70s, early 80s. Maybe I've got something useful to share, especially as I've mentioned in other videos, I've been hybridizing my martial arts and my weapons arts across a lot of different cultures and styles with a focus on pragmatism, which gets me to a weapon I haven't played with in a while, and like the deer horns you see behind me, I really like them, but I never had a good pair available to me at the time. The first pair I picked up were these cast aluminum things, which served fine as training tools, but yeah, they were soft, they couldn't take an edge, and they got smashed up and broken pretty easily. They are still available, I'll post a picture. And when it comes to training with something like this, a sai it's a blunt object. It's not going to slice you to pieces. You might, smash yourself, jab yourself. But one thing I would definitely have to recommend is if you are not familiar with what we're going to talk about today, I would not recommend starting training with the sharp version. There are many options for blunt practice tools, which you can also use for sparring. But you know me, I had to get myself the sharpest pair I could find. So, a lot of different names for these things. Butterfly knives or butterfly swords. Now, when you say butterfly knife, you tend to think of a ballet song, so I'll default to butterfly sword. Sometimes referred to, and forgive my horrible Cantonese and Mandarin pronunciations, Wudip-do or Hudie-dao. Okay? Based on, I think, the way they move, which we'll get back to in a little bit more handling later in the video. The other name for them is in Cantonese Bat Cham Dao, or in Mandarin Ba Jan Dao, which means 8 cutting, chopping swords or knives. Now in Chinese, Dao it's like messer. In European swords, it basically refers to any sizable single-edged knife-like thing, so it could be anything from knife length to sword length. They use the same word for it. These were produced by a company I kind of was passingly familiar with, but never purchased anything from them before, and that is Everything Wing Chun, and I absolutely recommend you go check out their site. I'll put the link down in the description, because if you're into Wing Chun, or the weapons related to, or other training equipment like wooden dummies, for instance, with the wooden dummy form being my favorite form from my years of Wing Chun training, forever ago. they're a great source. They are run by career practitioners, and they get design advice by, well, master practitioners. And they customize different lines of weapons and training equipment to specific sifus and lineages. So yeah, this is a company that is run by practitioners for practitioners. So you're getting some very specialized and, yes, customized equipment. And yeah, it's a little bit higher end. We'll talk about price later. But okay, let's talk about which particular design of their many designs I selected and why, and what I think about it in terms of fit, finish, quality, function, and yeah, handling. All right, before I get back around to the topic of handling and also discuss factors to consider in potentially selecting your own pair of these and why I selected this particular pair of these, I wanted to talk about specs and fit and finish. And since they're in the scabbard, let's start with the scabbard. Now, one of the things you're going to notice up front is these don't have that kind of half moon cross section that allows the two swords to sit flat up against each other as if they were one sword cut in half down the middle. And that's not something I'm super keen on, and I'll talk about that probably later. So these are sitting in separate slots in a pretty thick wooden scabbard that's covered in leather, and I think they did a really good job. It's got a stitch, seam on the side and a couple of straps to hold them in securely. What it doesn't have is any kind of frog or belt loop. Now there is a separate carrying case you could buy that this whole thing fits in. I might add a belt loop or frog or something, but this is a pretty thick, chunky, and yes, heavy thing to potentially carry on a belt. We'll talk about that when we get into the specs of the individual weapons. But I feel like this is sort of selected from a generic set of scabbards based on different blade, well, lengths and widths. Why? Well, one is there's a little bit of rattle in here, just towards the end. But two, I'll take the straps off and you can definitely see it better once I do that. The guards don't fit lined up flush with the top of the scabbard. There are a lot of different guard designs as well as blade shapes in their catalog, so I think they basically had sort of a one size fits this size kind of a thing going. It's not a big deal. If it really bugs me, I might make some changes to it, but it works for now. A little bit of rattle down here, but this is a little bit more about the individual swords than the scabbard. If I draw the knife that I have designated, and I will probably interchange the term knife and sword repeatedly because I've used both to describe these in my history. If I draw the right one, you'll notice it comes out very smoothly. If I go to draw the left one, there's a little snag. And that, it doesn't matter, you'll see the two slots here. Hello. There we go. Two slots. Figure out which way to turn my hand so you can see that. Doesn't matter which slot it's in, and it's because as handmade blades, there's a slight difference in the width at the widest part of the belly, and it's only a 1/16 of an inch. It's barely visible unless you lay them side by side or go to shove them in the scabbard. Yeah, so slight variance in that particular specification. But let's talk about, well, the specs and the fit and finish of the swords themselves. Okay, let's start with our usual out-of-the-box sharpness tests, shall we? How about some cardboard? That's pretty good. All right, so if you go to the Everything Wing Chun website, you're probably going to get pretty thoroughly overwhelmed by the range of swords that you have to select from. A lot of them are listed as being either custom order or out of stock, but even the out of stock ones, they put the little note on there that says if you really want this one, we can custom order it in most cases from the smith, and they'll get it to you. Well, it's probably going to be a wait versus getting one that's in stock, which they say they'll ship usually within 24 hours. They ship mine in 2 after I press the Pay Now button, and then from their home base in Ohio to where I live in Washington State, so basically, good chunk of the way across the country, USPS was estimating, 4 or 5 days delivery. I got these in 2, so really, really fast. 2 days after I ordered them, had them in hand. That was awesome. The awesome continues, though. All right, they have a wide range of swords to choose from plastic and wooden training sparring models to stainless steel blunt training swords to what they consider their combat line, which includes some really nice Damascus. But their main flagship line is in D2 steel. Now, I got a little bit of a scare when I opened the box and the invoice said, display swords. No, that's not what I ordered. And then I cut myself unwrapping them, so no, they're not display swords. And I should have read more of the fine print on the website. And there's a lot of print on the website. There's a lot of information for you on the website, not only to help you learn about these and make an informed decision about them, but there's also a lot of other training resources as well. So it's an awesome site if you're into Wing Chun. But fine print warning on the combat sharp blades. They call them display swords, probably for legal reasons, because they recommend that unless you are super familiar with these weapons, don't train with a sharp one, which I think I already mentioned that, so I'm not going to keep harping on that, but just so you know. Speaking of which, their main line swords, kind of their middle range for the combat steel, they're made out of D2 tool steel. They use stainless steel for their grips, and it's an AISI 304. So non-magnetic stainless. This is more of a semi-magnetic D2 steel. Rockwell hardness about 58. Hollow ground, as you can see, with a secondary bevel that's pretty shallow. Probably about a 20-degree edge. Now, it's not shaving sharp, but it's certainly significantly sharp, with a little bit of a blunt ricasso down here. Yeah, very nice. Now, different blade lengths and shapes I'll get into in a second, but I selected what's known as a hybrid in the length that suits me. Hybrid being in the middle between a sword that's biased for chopping and a sword that's biased for stabbing. So this one, for instance, the widest part of the belly is 2.5 inches, the ricasso is 2 1/4. So a little bit of a swell out towards the widest part of the belly. A chopper is going to have more, and then kind of a more, well, semi-blunt tip, versus the stabber, which is actually going to taper maybe a little bit down and get slightly narrower towards the blade and have a sharper tip. So, talk about that in a second. This is also from their lightweight line because it was in stock, and I also like the specs on it. So the weight on this is 21.5 ounces per sword. So keep that in mind. Point of balance is 2 1/4 inches. For a 12-inch blade, and I'll describe why I picked 12-inch blade. You have a selection of lengths you could pick from. Width doesn't have any distal taper, but on something that's more large knife size, I don't really care about that. The balance and the feel is great. Width, though, they seem kind of thin at 3/16 of an inch, but if you watch some of the videos they have from the smith, he puts it to some abuse, and it does some really amazing stuff in his workshop. So, yeah. I think it'll hold up just fine. There's no real flex in the blade to speak of. So it's nice and rigid. I think the width of it makes up for the thinness and just feels good. Now, their full weight ones are, well, I didn't get the specs on all of them. They vary from blade to blade, but you're probably looking at somewhere between 4 and 6 ounces heavier, depending on the weapon. Yeah, you'll have to look at the individual specs of what you pick. I kind of like this weight. It's very handy. Look at that in a second. But fit and finish. Polished, finish. There is a thin fuller on either side, but one of the things you might be able to see at a glance is they're offset. So they're not like right on top of each other. They're a little bit staggered by about a 1/16 of an inch. So it's not going to super thin out the blade right there. So I think that was a good design choice. The only marking on one side of each sword, opposite sides actually, so I can kind of tell left from right that way. It says Master Path and a little laser engraving, no other markings. But fit and finish, oh my. Start with the gap between the guard and the blade, because there pretty much is none. I can't even stick a thin piece of paper in there. It is that fine. Maybe less than 1/2 millimeter at the very edge, but yeah, the fit and finish of guard to blade, and the blade does fit down inside a slot in that guard. I've seen them disassembled. That's awesome. The guards are very nicely smoothed and rounded for flipping and handling. Talk about that in a minute. You've got, yes, a full 10 construction with G10 scales pinned on in multiple places, with also, you'll see that there's a center one, I don't know if you can get a good shot at that, that has inlay in it with kind of their logo, kind of a blossom logo, which is a nice touch. Polished but textured, so they're quite grippy. But fit and finish is absolutely flawless. There are no seams, no edges, no shelves. Yeah. Feels like one solid smooth piece. Build quality, wow. Okay, let's get back to the discussion of handling and some things to consider maybe in selecting your own. However, we should talk about price. How much did Mike pay for these? Well, like I said, they've got higher end ones that are closer to $1,000 or maybe more. Their plastic ones are well below $100. Their stainless steel ones run about 2-something USD, 200-something USD. $550 free shipping. So I think it was more than I was intending to spend, but I think I got a good deal. Well, let's take a more active look, shall we? Okay, so picking one of these for yourself is going to come down to a series of very important factors. First of all, your style and your lineage might be really specific on what you should be using. Then your individual teacher, Sifu or whatever, definitely probably also going to have some strong recommendations on what you should be using. And then it comes down to your build, your arm length and stuff like that. Kind of like picking an Iaito for Iaido. The school and the teacher, and then how long your reach is, what's comfortable for you. There's going to be some strong guidelines there. And then as you get more experienced, you might figure out what your own personal preference is over time. Now, let's start with blade profile. Should you be getting one, for instance, that's maximized for cutting, chopping with a wider blade and less of a tip? Supposedly these are preferred by monks because they were less lethal in terms of penetration. You can still thrust or stab with one. It's going to be kind of like getting stabbed with a shovel, which could be quite effective and discouraging to the guy on the other end of it, but less penetration potential versus a narrower blade, maybe even with a clip point to give it more of a stabby tip, but maybe not much as a meat in the blade for heavy chopping or strong paring. Again, depends on many factors. Let's talk about length. A lot of different ways you can measure these, and again, it does come down to the school, the teacher, your build, and specifically how you're going to use these. Now, with a sai, I measure a sai blade for me from the crook of my thumb in the reverse grip like this to a little bit past my elbow. So for me, that's 14 inches. Now, while I've got this in my hand, notice that how close this is to my forearm. This position is maximized not only for using this for parrying and blocking, which it can do. I've taken some pretty solid shots on this in blunt weapons practice, but if I was up against something sharp, my skin feels a little exposed there. It's also long enough that I could use a really close range elbow strike, right? That's one of the things you practice in sai. But you'll notice this one isn't as long. I've come to the point where, for me, and what I've learned and what I use and the way I use these things, my sweet spot is from the crook of my thumb to the inside fold of my elbow. Not so I don't stab myself that way, but I found that in the flipping, it gives me just that much more safety clearance to keep that sharp bit away from me. And in some of the techniques that I personally do, sometimes the swords move very close to each other, sometimes even inside each other. And if the blade is too long, yeah, you're really risking running into yourself. So for me, 12 inches is what I've learned is my personal sweet spot. Weight, well, again, it depends on what you're training. A heavier blade is certainly going to be better physical training versus a lighter one, which is going to move quicker, and just finding what you personally like. I kind of like the weight of these. They're not too heavy, not too light. They're just right for me. They turned out perfectly that way. So length, weight, blade profile, for me, good choice. Let's talk about that hook and the flipping. But before I do that, I need to point out that every surface of this thing is a potential weapon, offensively or defensively. You can certainly thrust or stab with the tip, right? Cutting and slashing with the blade, but back edge can be used for parrying or striking like a sai. If you have a clip point on the back, it's like a false edge on a sword, yeah, you can use that too. But these are beefy enough that you can not only parry, but slap with the flat. You can punch with the knuckle guard, and you can strike with the pommel. You can also, like a sai, use the fork of the prong there to strike out in something basically like a tiger claw strike in certain styles of karate. Yeah, catch somebody just right in certain places. That could be a discouraging blow. But that is also designed for either flipping or trapping or both, but not necessarily both equally well. A trapping hook ideally is more like the hook on a jute, which is going to be narrower in the gap to really grab that blade and hold on to it. But you're then not going to have room to get your thumb in there to flip the thing. And the way you tend to trap with these is once you get the thing in there, you've got rotation this way for tension, but then leverage this way to potentially twist somebody out of, the sword out of their hand or bind them up to create an opening. So it's a subtle combination of movements that's used in that hooking, trapping action. But in order to do that, you better have a hook that's strong. Some of the flimsier ones or the thin brass ones or die-cast ones, yeah, the aluminum ones I had on my original cast swords didn't survive. I had a pair that were big strip slabs of steel, just kind of curved around, and you can still see butterfly swords that have those guards, but those are not going to be very comfortable for flipping. Having the spine basically aligned with the back of the grip is not only good for point control, but it gives you clearance to flip without having a blade that's kind of sticking out in your way. So a bigger hook, better for flipping, worse for trapping. Narrower hook, better for trapping, worse for flipping. Shape of the guard also is going to play into this. With these good solid steel guards, I feel pretty confident. Now, in that reverse grip, again, not all lineages flip. I've studied both, but yeah, Mike likes his dangerous fidget spinners, so Mike does this, and especially since I can do it again. This makes me very happy to be able to do this. But in the reverse grip, like a sai, I can punch, I can hit with the guard, don't really have the clearance to elbow stab, but I could, at close range, kind of do a lean in and slash, and yeah, you can cant your wrist out and potentially do a stab. Can I just simply hold this thing in an ice pick grip? I could, but that just feels really awkward and unnatural to me, and it's a harder transition. There's certainly ways, well, you just saw me do it. But I think the best thing about this position for me is, compared to the sai, the level of protection I feel like I have. Not only do I have a lot more clearance between my delicate flesh and what could potentially be stopping an incoming weapon, but I've got a D-guard to protect my hand. That is a nice shield. just really nice shield. And again, if somebody gets right on top of me, it's still got sword blade-like potential, quick to flip it out into its more active position. Yeah, I like the flipping option. Now, it's already gone on a little bit too long, but I wanted to talk about, let's talk about some other applications and weapons combinations. All right, this is getting long. I apologize. I'll try to make it quick. I was inspired to reconsider these as I was doing my review on the cold steel rifleman's knife, which I mentioned that I selected because I was looking for a beefy companion blade to go with, well, a beefy one-handed sword like a basket hilt broadsword or backsword. Then when I discovered I could do this again, that kind of sealed the deal for me, and I decided, yeah, I really want to get into experimenting with these again, training with them. Now, in the Chinese styles that you see today, you often see paired identical weapons. It's probably one of the most common double weapon combinations you see, but most other cultures, they pair complementary weapons for different reasons. But I suspect that this is also true in Chinese history as well. You just don't see it so much in practice. Now, I have seen some very interesting combinations in Chinese weaponry, such as a sword and a 9-section chain whip. That's a heck of a combination, right? So they did exist, but pairing shorter blade and longer blade. There's a reason why this is so popular and works so well, because of the way they complement each other. And unlike having two long blades, they don't get in each other's way as much. So they move around each other, with each other, very effectively. And this, with its mass and hand protection and that catching hook, I think this is a great companion for any one-handed sword. Plus, flipped into the reverse position, yeah, that's darn good too. Yeah, like that. So many possibilities here that I can see worth exploring. Now, if you are carrying weapons like this, there would certainly be occasion where you just use the short one, the dagger, the knife, the short sword, whatever it is, and yeah, you could simply just use one of these at a time. Or, I mentioned that a longer version of these was commonly used, at least in the Qing dynasty, with a shield, which in that sense was usually a rotella-sized rattan shield. I don't feel like dragging out my bigger one right now. But yeah, combination of these two things together, I can definitely see where that would be very interesting, very effective. Other thing you might or might not have noticed, Mike does not move in, shall we say, the traditional sense in terms of what I'm doing doesn't look like any specific forms, because, you know, I've studied a lot of different forms and rolled it over into, well, other similar arts techniques, and what you tend to see me doing is either a lot more fluid or something that looks a lot more like what you'd see in terms of live fencing in HEMA or something like that. So yeah, not very traditional. That's just not going to be my thing. Not that I don't see value in that. That's where I started. But you may also have noticed me doing some things that might look a little familiar to practitioners of Filipino martial arts, who again might use pairs of the same weapons or complementary weapons or one weapon and an empty hand. A lot of potential for crossover there as well. But let's cut it off here before it gets just put you all to sleep. Let's start our usual conversation. If you have any questions about these or the use of weapons like this in general, if you want to see more content like this, let me know in the comments. I'll try to follow up with that. Again, my caveats from previous videos, I don't consider myself any kind of master, expert, anything like that. But I have been experimenting, training with these for a long time. So you'll notice I do have a certain familiarity with them, and I'm not afraid of the fact that these are pretty sharp. But again, that's my risk. I don't recommend that you train with a sharp one until you are super confident. Yeah, I'm not recommending that at all. But if you've had experience with similar weapons, Similar style, similar training. Let's talk about that too. Otherwise, until next time, as usual. Thanks for watching, especially this longer one. Following, liking, subscribing, commenting, having that conversation. And I hope to see you back for, well, whatever comes out of this. Because, yeah, being able to do that is just really exciting.